Let's go through a couple of pieces of it and see what you've thought. Reminding you briefly, the dream was of this man who is standing up on a cliff, fishing into some water, pulls himself up this decaying fish. Did you have any thoughts on the symbolism, potential symbolism in that?
Symbolism is all you do to your own self.
Right. Okay. I'm going to repeat what you say. Okay. I'm going to repeat what you say so we get this on audio. So what you're saying is the symbolism is always going to be in part in the eye of the beholder here, which is a very important point. And we'll get back to that in a few minutes because it's a critical issue of whose associations or whose thoughts are we really getting at here.
A whale, a good whale or a bad whale?
That's right. Was it a good whale or a bad whale? Was our snakes good snakes or bad snakes, depending on the person? Okay. Any thoughts about what it meant that he was fishing into this polluted water and that he... yes.
Well, he's looking for an alternative lifestyle.
He's looking for an alternative lifestyle.
And when he pulled in the polluted water, he's going from the purity of celibacy, right?
Okay, so he's pulled into the water, going from the purity of celibacy into the pollution of relationships, is what you said. It seems like a very likely hypothesis. Did some of you think something similar along those lines?
Yeah, supposed to be a fisherman.
I'm sorry?
It was also be a fisherman.
A fisherman.
He's a priest.
He's a priest, right? That's an interesting idea, that he's a fisherman of men, that he's attending to a flock or to a school, I guess. Okay. What other thoughts do you have about his action of fishing? Yes.
Maybe he thinks he's performing a futile exercise.
Okay, maybe he thinks he's performing a futile exercise. What do you mean?
They're doing something that he shouldn't be doing.
Okay, he's doing something he shouldn't be doing. What he gets out of this is this decaying fish, this rotten, nasty thing. Yes. Guilt. Okay.
Sex.
Dirty sex. So the idea is that this pollution and what he pulls up here has to do with the dirtiness of sex.
He's no doubt been brought up in a rigid Catholic environment. The church said all these things, but he learned as a child.
Okay, so the church said all these things that he learned as a child about the evils of sex. Yes, in the back. Something taboo. Okay, so that's how you're interpreting this rotten thing that he's pulling up. Okay.
Christian, the dirty Christian.
I don't think we'll repeat that one for our listening audience. Yes.
The Venus we went to the same thing.
Okay, the fascinating thing is a couple of things. One is that he notices that these women are swimming around in this dirty sex, in this polluted water. Why are they doing it? This is a man, one of the principles of dream interpretation is that what you do is you take, just as we're doing, you take each part of the dream and you try to understand its meaning. But to do that, what you do is, and this is what Freud recommended, because the person doesn't necessarily have access to all of those unconscious meanings, what you do is you say, I want you to think about this part. Think about, say, fishing into the water. And I want you to just tell me whatever comes to mind. The idea is that our thoughts are all connected in our mind, our thoughts and our feelings and our wishes and our beliefs. If you start activating one, it's going to start activating the other. And if you just talk off the top of your head, you can get around the repression, and you can essentially start to explore the structure of those associations in your head, how they all fit together. Just we'll get to the section of polluted water. The issue in that is that this is a man who, when he started associating to that, he started talking about his ideas as a child. He was the only child in a Catholic family, had all kinds of ideas as a child about how somehow he had damaged his mother in being born, and that's why she couldn't have more children. And so he had these ideas about sex somehow destroying women, aside from the fact that he believed it was bad. He believed especially that it was bad for women. What he couldn't understand is, why would these women on their own be swimming around in this water? Why would they choose to swim around in this water, which he saw as dirty and disgusting and as something women wouldn't want to be in? If I can back you up 1 second back to his fishing, and if you when you think of terms for what is the implement you fish with? It's a rod. Anything else come to mind? Okay, that's how the principle of associations works. It's a rod. What are other names for a fishing rod? Pole. All of these are nice phallic imagery. Here he is essentially putting his rod or his pole out, and he's catching something on it. Again, you can imagine the symbolism about what it is that he's catching that's so disgusting and awful. Now, he lands with his feet in the water. He finds himself with his feet just dipping in the water. What do you make of that? I'm sorry? That it's not so bad. In fact, he was just getting his feet wet, so to speak, at that time in a metaphorical way in sexuality. He was just starting to be involved in foreplay, which he had never been involved in before. What about the whale in distance? Any thoughts about the whale? Yes. I'm sorry? Jonah. What about Jonah?
Being swallowed by.
Being swallowed by the whale. So one of the fears he may have is what happens if he gets swallowed by this relationship, which seems perfectly likely given his ideas about what relationships are about and how much trouble they can give you. What other thoughts about the whale?
Catholic Church name.
Catholic Church, how so?
And being a large body, larger than me, larger than man, they had ability to swallow not honorable.
Interesting idea. The idea that the whale could be symbolizing this large institution that could be especially associated with guilt that could swallow him up for what he's doing. Any other thoughts about the whale, about what kind of whale it might be?
What this lady said is, so this man here talking about, was it a sperm whale? And then we wondered if it didn't have a sexual kind of.
Okay, so the question then is this a sperm whale, in which you'd like to attribute to this gentleman, which of course you figured out yourself? Okay, so the question is this a sperm whale? That's one of the first kind of whales you think of. What is it that whales do? Whales spout. Now again, you think of all the phallic imagery in that, and the fact that this... Yes, we have moved into the R-rated portion of our show. What you can see is that what potentially there could be some imagery is here he is, again, he's thinking about these women swimming around in this polluted, disgusting water. He doesn't understand why they're there. He believes at some deep level that he has hurt his mother sexually and made her unable to have more children. Here is this sperm whale coming from, or this whale coming from the distance, this big phallic, potentially spouting creature coming at these women from the distance, and they are unperturbed. And again, what this led to were associations in his own mind about how he couldn't understand why his girlfriend was allowing him to touch her. Because to him, it seemed this was all dirty and something that a woman wouldn't allow and wouldn't want, and he simply couldn't figure that out. So this is, again, the way you interpret a dream. Now, this raises some important questions, which is, are associations in the eye of the beholder, are interpretations in the eye of the beholder? How do we know these are his interpretations rather than our own interpretations? How do we know we're not just coming up with, say, phallic symbol interpretations of whales because we're now talking about Freud? It's a good question, and it's one that's not easily answered. The best way to get at it, or one of the ways to get at it anyway, is to do what we're not doing here, which is we actually explored his associations. So it wasn't a matter of my saying, okay, so then, what do you think about whales? They kind of spout? I mean, I didn't do that. We looked at the whales and we looked at what his associations were, and we went with his associations rather than with mine. Though obviously there's a huge subjective component to this. The interesting thing about it is it makes considerable sense. Whether you're convinced by it is one matter. Whether you can tell which interpretation is right is clearly another. It's hard to know any objective criteria you could use to do that, any more than you could come up with objective criteria to decide which English professor has a better take on Moby Dick. But what can you do? You do your best, and we're not going to talk about why Moby Dick was the particular name that came to my mind of a book, but actually we are, because I'm going to talk about just how those things come to mind in those particular ways. This issue of how we know whether these things are true, in fact, whether we know our interpretations are right, raises some serious issues about, is there any evidentiary basis for psychoanalysis or for psychoanalytic thinking, for the psychoanalytic approach to personality? I've given you a lot of clinical examples, and some of them may sound quite compelling. I've given you examples of my friend Bill as another example. So some of these things may seem compelling to you, but the question is there any basis for them? As I mentioned before, most academic psychologists at universities who do research would probably suggest that psychoanalysis maybe had a couple of good ideas, but by and large, it's a historical perspective. It's one that came along, had some interesting ideas, was largely flaky, and that Freud was largely a neurotic or a pervert, and that's the end of the matter. And the question is that indeed true? Is there any evidence for this theory other than, well, I had a patient once who said? That raises the issue of what counts as evidence in psychology. I'm going to divert to this for a minute or two, but then I am going to return to some empirical evidence for this. And by empirical, again, it's one of those words that means data from observation. I'm firmly convinced when I talk to my patients and I don't tell them, I don't tell this guy, so the whales spout. And he says, well, I think of whales and I think of sperm whales and I think of spouting. That to me is data. That person is telling me something. I am observing it. I have not put it in his mind. Now, I have, in fact, I may have made other interpretations in the past which could make him think I want to hear that kind of interpretation. There's no way to know what the influence of that is. But I do think when a patient tells me things that the patient is not knowing that I could possibly be expecting, or tells me something new that I would not have expected, that fits into some pattern, that is observation. That is, in fact, data. But let me talk about now why it is that many psychologists believe that that these kind of data from clinical hours don't count and shouldn't count, and why psychoanalysis, they would argue, is not a valid scientific theory of psychology. And then I'm going to talk about some of the psychoanalytic responses to that, and then I'm going to get into some experimental data that document some of these unconscious processes. Briefly, there are a number of reasons why a lot of psychologists reject psychoanalysis outright, and there are some good reasons for these. One is that because psychoanalysts don't primarily rely on experiments, their findings are not replicable. That is, you can't take the same study and repeat it. You can't say, take this patient who's been treated for 8 years with psychoanalysis 5 times a week on the couch, put him into a behavioral treatment and see if the same things emerge. It's not going to happen. You've already changed this person through that process. So no one else can see this, and no one else can try the study again. That's one strong reason. A second is that there is indeed a great deal of subjective bias that gets into psychoanalytic or psychodynamic interpretations. And that is that here we are coming up with ideas about what the whale means, for example, that are based a lot on our own theoretical expectations, etc. And it's very easy when you're dealing with patients to start seeing in them the things that you expect to see. If, for example, I've worked with 10 anorexics, and I've noticed that each of them has a lot of issues around control and having control over things, which seem to get expressed over control over even their hunger in their bodies. Next anorexic patient who walks in my office, you can bet I'm going to have the expectation when she says something that's related to that, I'm going to start seeing it that way. So how do you get that kind of thing out? And that is clearly a bias on clinical data. A third bias is that these are not data that can be publicly seen. These are data that only the psychotherapist can see with the patient, so that you have 2 people who have access to it. And the question is, how can you base a science on something that only 2 people have access to? And in fact, even worse, many of the psychoanalysts would respond, well, you just don't have access to the right kind of data. If you did, you would see what we see. And the response by the experimentalists is, well, look, you're saying that I've got to go through years of psychoanalytic training or training as a clinical psychologist so I can see these data and I can then attest to whether or not they're true. But I'm already going to be committed to those beliefs if I go through all those years of training. You're saying no one can judge these beliefs except people who are already committed to them? That doesn't make any sense. Finally, there are over 400 schools of psychotherapy out there. There are multiple schools within psychoanalysis and within more broadly psychodynamic perspectives which look at conflicting forces in the mind. Given that they all have their different beliefs and they can each say, well, I had a patient once who demonstrates this, how can you ever come up with anything that's generalizable that you can actually say with some certainty, I think this is true? And those are all questions and issues with which I must say I have considerable sympathy. And it's why I do experimental research as well as being a clinician. On the other hand, there are a number of ways that psychoanalytically oriented psychologists would respond, which I think are also important. One is that what you believe in depends a great deal on what you see. If you're an experimentalist studying perception or studying cognition or studying personality, and you bring in college students who are most of the subjects in most psychology experiments, usually white middle-class college students, you bring them in for a 30-minute or 45-minute experiment where you set everything up. You say, here are the conditions, you expose them to them, and you see how they react on one very small variable or a small group of variables. Or you give people a questionnaire and you ask them, fill out this questionnaire, and then you say, well, out of all these things, I've never seen any evidence of psychodynamic processes. I don't see unconscious conflict, etc. The reason you're not seeing it could well be because it doesn't exist, or it could be because you're not doing using any kind of methods that would ever get at it. That if you're wanting to get at something complex that could be going on in a person's mind of which they have very little awareness, that could be deeply emotional, that could show up in lots of relationships, you're probably not going to get it in a minimal kind of relationship with a subject who doesn't even know you, in a setting in which you're seeing them for 45 minutes or for an hour. So in some ways, I guess a metaphor, a comparison to this might be, an analogy, I guess, might be, a patient comes into his GP and says, I think I've got some prostate trouble. The GP looks down his throat and says, I see no evidence of prostate enlargement. Essentially, you may be looking for personality in all the wrong places. That if you do these kind of studies and you don't actually listen to see what people are like in death over a matter of time, you're not going to see it. You're looking through the wrong lens and in the wrong way. So that's one possible response to that. It is interesting as well that most practicing psychotherapists do in fact believe heavily in psychodynamic theory, whether that's the exclusive theory or not. Most practicing therapists say they do believe in it to some degree. And that raises questions of when we say that the academic psychologists by and large are cognitive, which they are, versus the clinical psychologists, by and large, have some combination of theories, one of which is psychodynamic. Is the difference because there's a difference in the truth of their theories, or is it simply a matter of what they're looking at and who they're looking at? And one is looking at largely college students in controlled circumstances at different questions, and the other is looking at largely people who are in treatment. So that's one response that the analyst might make. A second is that learning rules of inference for trying to interpret behavior or for interpreting what people are saying or what their behaviors mean takes years of training, just like it takes years of training to become a good experimentalist. And so that when a experimentalist says to the psychoanalyst, well, look, you say you've seen defense mechanisms, which we'll talk about soon, where people defend against things they don't want to know about. You say you've seen this. You say you've seen unconscious processes. Show it to me in an experiment. Other than the data that you've got, I had a patient once who did this and that. Other than that, what evidence do you have for this? In some ways, that's like going to your radiologist and saying, okay, I've got a limp. I'm not walking well. And the radiologist x-rays it and says that you have a small fracture. And you say, well, look, doc, I can't read these pictures of yours. I don't have your training, these pretty black and white pictures. Other than that, what evidence do you have that I have a fracture? And the radiologist says, but you got a limp. And I said, well, I could have a limp for lots of reasons. I could be a hysterical reaction. I mean, I could, there are all kinds of reasons I could have a limp. It could be a tendon. It could be, it could be a muscle. It could be anything. You see the point, which is that if you don't, essentially, if you don't have the training to see something in a particular way, you may not be able to see it when it is in fact there. And it's the same thing of someone who doesn't know experimental method, who tries to read the journals in the articles in the Journal of Experimental Psychology. They wouldn't understand what's going on, but that doesn't mean that those things don't exist. So that's a second response. A third is, if I can be snide, which I can, many tenured professors of psychology do not believe in unconscious processes. That's actually changing, as we'll talk about shortly, though they certainly don't believe in unconscious motivational processes. My guess is 95% of psychologists would tell you who teach at universities that there are no unconscious motivational processes, that there is no evidence for them. And it's just in the last 7 years that there's been a change so that now most psychologists believe in unconscious cognitive processes because they've demonstrated them in the laboratory. And there's been really a massive change in that. But if there are studies that find that kids by the age of 9 or 10 understand repression. They understand that, for example, if someone has really painful memories, they may not want to think about them. Or they understand the concept of denial, that if you've just found out that your sister died, and then I've actually done this study with kids myself, where you'll ask them, Johnny just heard that his sister died. A few minutes later, he goes in and says, no, that's not possible. I just saw her. Why do you think he's doing that? Kids recognize because he doesn't want to know that his sister is dead. Now, if a tenured professor of psychology, 40, 50 years old, doesn't understand that we have unconscious processes, that they can conflict with each other, that they can motivate us at times, then maybe that person's just psychologically sort of tone deaf. And we shouldn't essentially say, therefore, everyone else ought to go jumping through hoops to show through experiments that these things exist that every 10-year-old know exist. That would be a final response. And again, to use an analogy, it would be like playing a melody to a person who is tone deaf. And then when he tries to sing it back to you and can't do it, you say, well, see, there's no melody. I mean, if a person doesn't know this kind of stuff by the age of 40 or 50, it's maybe perhaps their problem rather than the field's. So those would be responses of the psychoanalyst to the experimentalist on this score. But now, and then I'm done being snide, let me go back to being an experimentalist and to talk about some of the data for unconscious processes that do now exist in the literature. I'm going to start with what I'm going to do is I'm going to first talk about how there is some of the data that has to do with unconscious thought processes, which most psychologists now, as of really 7 years ago, when 7 or 8 years ago, when a book first came out called The Unconscious Revisited, which was a book by a couple of cognitively oriented people, which said essentially this stuff about unconscious processes is indeed all true. People do have them. And then there's some many recent papers now from various kind of experimental research programs documenting unconscious cognitive processes. By cognitive, I simply mean thought processes of one sort or another. So let me start by talking about unconscious thought processes and evidence for those. I'll then talk about unconscious emotion and whether or not we can, in fact, whether there's evidence that suggests that we can feel things of which we're unaware. Finally, I'll finish by talking about unconscious motivational processes and whether, in fact, there's evidence that we can be motivated by things of which we are not aware. Starting with unconscious thought, I'd like to do a little experiment here. I want to divide the room right down about, how about right here? All of you on this side. Okay, so there'll be half of you on this side, half of you on this side. Now I want all of you on, that's not quite even, but that will have to do. All of you on this side, for the next 30 seconds, I would like you to close your eyes tightly close your ears tightly because I don't want you to hear a word that I'm saying. Count to yourself to about 30 slowly so you come back at the right time. Okay? No cheating. Okay, over here. I want you to memorize some word pairs, okay? Those are taxi, cab, light, house, paper, pencil. Do you have rehearse those in your mind for a second? Okay. May all return? Hello? Right. Okay, you're all back now. Okay. Are you? Yes. Gave some of you license to sleep for the rest of the lecture. I'd like you all now to count backwards from 100 to 90. Aloud.
100. Back down. 8. 8. Okay.
Okay. I'm glad we all did that simultaneously. Now what I'd like you to do is I'd like you in your mind to think of the spelling of, let's start out with the word, let's see which word I'd like you to try. Let's start with the word fair. In your mind, spell fair. However it comes to you, whatever comes to your mind, spell fair in your mind. Okay, let's start with this side of the room. How many of you spelled it F-A-I-R? Okay, how many of you spelled it F-A-R-E? How many of you spelled it some other way? This is a diagnostic procedure for embarrassing illiterates publicly. Now, on this side of the room, how many of you spelled it F-A-I-R? How many of you spelled it F-A-R-E? Well, there's an experiment that didn't work. What the experiment was designed to show, see why I'll never get tenure anywhere. What the experiment was designed to show is that what should have happened is there should have been more people who spelled it F-A-R-E over here. And in fact, I just did this with a group of 1,000 about 3 months ago, and it worked like a charm. We had about 50-50 over here, but oh, I guess I should tell you over here since you're not in the dark. Since you're in the dark, what I did was I had these people memorize a series of word pairs, and those series of word pairs included taxi, cab was one of those word pairs. And what happens is that we have, you got it, taxi, cab, and fare are all connected. What happens is that the way mental processes are connected, the way thoughts are connected in our minds is that they're essentially things that are related are connected on what are called networks of association. So that we have these things that are associated with each other. And that if you activate one part of the network, it tends to spread activation to the rest of the network. That's a theory called, not surprisingly, spreading activation. So what happens then is because you've activated this part of the network, those things are activated, but they're not conscious yet. And I in fact had you count backwards from 100 to 90, just so that it would not be conscious. So that this would be an unconscious influence and not a conscious one. But what it normally does, except in people who seem not to know how to spell very well or something, or a room full of people without unconscious processes, which is also possible, what typically happens is that that it causes people over here to spell it with much more frequency with F-A-R-E, even though F-A-I-R is the preferred spelling. Now that's an example of an unconscious thought process. All of this is happening under the surface. We'll get back to questions afterwards if that's okay. Well, if you ask people this, oh no, I'm sorry, it's the preferred spelling in terms of if you ask people this question, most people will come up with F-A-I-R. That's the one that they know better, and that's the one they, no, it's not the preferred spelling in the sense that one is correct and one is incorrect. Oh, no, I shouldn't mess with an editor. No. So that's the one that people normally come up with most of the time, but in fact it usually shifts in rooms filled with normal people on this side. So that's an example of an unconscious process. Now, the interesting thing about this is you can find the same exact thing happens, but the person may never have registered the words consciously at all. And the way you can do this is you can use a what's called a dichotic listening procedure, where you essentially have the person, you give the person in two different channels, they're wearing earphones. In one channel, they hear one stream of words, and the other channel, they hear the other stream of words. You can train them through a procedure to listen only in one channel. It's a procedure called shadowing, where you have them essentially repeat what's going on in this one. After a while, they can't hear, they're not registering any of this stuff. And if you ask them, did you hear the word taxi in this ear? They have no idea. They're at chance. They cannot tell you because they're focusing exclusively on this ear. Now, what's interesting is if you play those same kind of word pairs into this ear, and then so that they're not attending to it, but then you ask them to spell fair, you will get a significant difference in that if they have heard taxi cab in this ear, they are more likely to spell it F-A-R-E. Now, they have not processed the information at all consciously, yet you are still seeing that there was some kind of unconscious processing that was going on that primed the spelling F-A-R-E, or that activated that spelling F-A-R-E, that there has been an activated network of associations on that side.
You're saying those people are so smart they overrode?
That must be what it is. We had such a smart group over here that they knew what was happening. They decided to override it. Actually, they wanted to kill the video version of this. But so those are some examples of unconscious thought processes. In terms of unconscious emotion, now this is a tougher one. You would think, how can emotion be unconscious? You either feel something or you don't. Let me give some examples of that as well. Some studies by a psychologist named Broadbent some time ago found that if you show people words on an instrument called a tachistoscope, that's one word I slow down on. If you show them if you flash words briefly on a T-scope, what you find, it is sometimes called a T-scope, which is what I will now call it. You will find that there's a difference in how much of the time they will register. If you flash it very quickly, some percent of the time they'll register. They'll say, "Yeah, I saw the word blue." If you give them neutral words on the one hand versus taboo words that may be socially unacceptable in some way, they will be less likely to see the ones consciously, to be able to say, yeah, I did see that word. And it doesn't appear to be a matter of just they don't want to say it aloud, because there's all kinds of ways this has been varied, where they do this in private, where they write things down, etc., where they know it's totally confidential. There appears to be a bias in that there's some kind of level of emotional processing that's going on that's saying, is this an acceptable word to think, before you even recognize it in the first place? Now, that's one fairly simple example, but let me give you a couple more. You can, for example, through a procedure where, suppose you, every time a person hears the word, say, dog, you give them a mild electric shock. You can gradually get them to, every time they hear the word dog now, for some time after this in the experiment, you're going to see physiologically measured some kind of anxiety response, like in their galvanic skin response, where you're essentially measuring anxiety through the skin. Or through their heart rate is another way that you can measure it. Okay, so you do this. If you play a series of words through the unattended channel in a dichotic listening task, and one of those words is dog, you will see a spike of activity on their GSR, the galvanic skin response, even though they have not heard that word. So essentially what's happening is they are emotionally reacting. Physiologically, you can see the emotional reaction, even though they have no idea of what has happened. They haven't heard the word. And if you ask them, are you anxious? They'll typically tell you no. So you may not even have consciousness of the emotion or the affect. That's a psychologist's word for emotion, is affect. They may not have consciousness of that feeling, but nevertheless, there's clear evidence that feeling has occurred. Let me give you another example or two. There's a phenomenon that's been described by a psychologist named Bob Zients, who's a colleague of mine, called the mirror exposure effect. And what it means is, if you expose people to something enough times, they'll start to like it. This is a principle that's used heavily by disc jockeys. You play the most putrid song over and over and over again, before you know, people are humming it to themselves and even like calling in at request lines. So it's called mirror exposure, and you can do this with nonsense syllables. Like if you play a series of show a person a series of nonsense syllables like nop and tog and that kind of thing, and you show them some of those more times and some of them less times, you'll see that they will gradually start to like knock and tog, or whatever I said, nop and tog. They'll start to like them better than the other nonsense syllables. Okay, so essentially it shows that the more you're exposed to it, the more you tend to like it. Well, what Zients and one of his then students and now colleagues, Tim Wilson, did was to try playing a series of tones, essentially a musical sequence, a tone sequence, different series in this unattended channel. So again, in a dichotic listening task, they're listening over here. You play some tone series in this channel over here. The person has no awareness of having heard them. You play them for them and say, have you heard this before? They're at chance about whether or not they've heard it. So they don't know, in comparison with one they haven't heard, they can't tell you whether or not they've heard it before. So clearly, it's never entered consciousness. Yet if you ask them, well, just tell me which ones of these tone sequences you like better, you will find that they will tend to like better the ones they have heard in that unattended channel. They have unconsciously processed that information enough that they have an emotional response that is different, that was generated entirely outside of awareness. It's another example of unconscious emotional processing. Another example comes from amnesics, from people who have lost some aspect of their memory. There's a classic case of a man who was called HM, obviously to protect his privacy, studied by Brenda Milner, who's a neuropsychologist. And HM, in order to control an intractable case of epilepsy, had some surgery on his brain. And one of the things that they did, unfortunately, was they cut out underneath underneath the temporal lobe, they cut out some structures in the limbic system. One in particular called the hippocampus, which is involved in storing new memories that allows you then to know that to recall that you have experienced something before. So that HM, for after this point, when he would meet Brenda Milner, he'd meet her every day and didn't know who she was. She'd say, "Hi, I'm Brenda Milner. Do you remember me?" He says, "No, never met you before." And this would go on day after day after day after day. So he had no ability to store new memories of this kind. The interesting thing was that he was once told, I hope I have this story exactly right, especially since this is on videotape, but if not, it's close enough. He was once told when his father or mother died. And there was one incident that I do know for sure he was told when his mother went into the hospital. But I believe he was told when his father died. And the interesting thing about it was he obviously got very, very upset for the moment. And then if he's distracted, and then you ask him, "How's your father?" "Guess my father's fine. I don't know." Well, you can be really sadistic with this, by the way. Hey, HM, your dad died. He starts to cry and you distract him. "Hey, what's that over there?" "Huh. Hey, HM, your dad died." Anyway, I wouldn't do something like that, of course, but only for science. So HM doesn't know consciously that his father died. But when what happened over time was that he could tell you that he had some vague feeling that something was wrong with his father, but he didn't know what it was. He said, "Yeah, I know my father's fine, but I just have this vague, uneasy feeling about him." What had happened was that the parts of the brain that are involved in storing emotional information were not disrupted. They were not eliminated when the hippocampus was removed. So he was still storing emotional information of some sort, but he couldn't put together the conscious cognitive representation of what it was that had happened to his father. Another example of an unconscious affective process or unconscious emotional process. Let me now talk about a study that says something about unconscious emotion, defense, and motivation, and then we'll move into unconscious motivation in particular. This is a study done by another one of my colleagues, who his name is Jonathan Shedler. He worked with a couple of other psychologists in these studies, and what he did was he was convinced in looking over a number of studies. Most studies of personality are studies that look at typically college students filling out questionnaires. And he was convinced that questionnaires are not a very good source of data because people have all kinds of defensive biases while they're filling them out. That if a person says, "I don't have many psychological symptoms," you give them a checklist of anxiety symptoms or depressive symptoms, that maybe 70% of the people who say, "I don't have any depressive symptoms or anxiety symptoms," are probably reporting accurately. Another 30% or 20% or whatever percent, he argued, are defensively denying that they have these problems. They don't want to know about them. Or if you give them a self-esteem test, they'll say they have great self-esteem. But if you ask someone with a severe narcissistic personality disorder, which I may give some examples of later, who has a paradoxical sense of tremendous grandiosity on top of can be so easily deflated that the person feels totally devalued or totally bad about himself or herself. If you take a person like that and you ask that person to fill out a questionnaire on self-esteem, you'll often get the grandiose one. But that doesn't mean that the other one isn't lurking there under the surface and that you could activate it if, for example, you slighted this person in some way. But so what Shedler suggested was that there are two kinds of high scores on these kind of tests. One is a true high score and the other is a defensive high score, what he called illusory mental health. So he figured out an ingenious way of getting this. He gives these people these questionnaires, and it's an eroticism questionnaire. He did it once he's done it with anxiety and other kind of questionnaires. You get very, very similar results. Then he has people write out their earliest 8 or 10 memories from their earliest life. And this is a diagnostic test that's used by psychoanalytically oriented psychologists with some frequency to try to get at a person's way they experience relationships, to get at the emotional quality of their memories, for example. When you're simply thinking back to the 10 earliest memories you can have, are there people in them? Do the people do nice things to you? Do they do bad things to you? Do you care about the people? Do you not care about the people? So what he did was he had the originator of the test, Marty Maiman, what he had Marty do was to go back and score these early memories and simply to sort the people into either blind to their questionnaires, they are either relatively healthy or relatively sick. And that's all he wanted to know psychologically. Then he breaks down the people from their questionnaires into the basis of relatively healthy and relatively sick. And what he wants to know is what's the relationship among the people who on the one hand say, "I am healthy," and Marty says, "Yes, you are healthy." The ones who say, "I am not healthy," and Marty says, "You're absolutely right, you're not healthy." And then the other ones who say, "I am healthy," and Marty says, "Sick puppy." Now, the question is, will they respond differently in some way? And what kind of index could you use that's not self-report to get at it? Well, what Shedler suggested was that if a person makes this much effort defending against parts of himself or herself that are problematic, that's probably going to take some physiological toll. And his bet was that you could find it in that person's heart. And so he used an index of heart pathology. Actually, he used a combined index of blood pressure and heart rate that has been linked to cardiac problems. And he measured these people while taking a psychological test that some people can find fairly stressful, as well as in solving unsolvable problems, difficult math problems, and that kind of thing. Now, the interesting thing was the people who he also took some other measures, like as they were coming up with, in the psychological test, they had to invent stories. And he had someone blind go back, not literally blind, he had someone go back and code the audio tapes of their stories and count the number of times they sighed or blocked and had long pauses or said or sounded in some way like they were blocking in some kind of way. He also asked them to rate how anxious they felt while taking this test. The interesting thing was the people who reported themselves as not problematic at all, but who Marty said were really in trouble, they were off the charts in terms of their physiological reactivity. They were by far significantly higher than the other two groups in terms of their blood pressure and heart rate during the task. They, in terms of the number of times they blocked and stuttered and stammered and sighed, it was much higher than the other groups. And even on top of that, when they were asked how they felt during it, they reported the least anxiety. So here are a group of people who were absolutely bent on not seeing themselves as anxious, and they didn't see themselves as anxious, but it did indeed take a toll on their hearts. Final example, moving into unconscious motivation. An example of unconscious motivation. This is a study done by McClelland, or a series of studies done by McClelland, Weinberger, and Kestner. What they wrote about was the fact that there are a couple of ways that people have typically studied motivation. One is simply ask people, do you value achievement? Is achievement important to you? Do you like power? Do you like to dominate people, etc.? That's one way. And that's called essentially self-reported, or they call it self-attributed motives. There's another way of doing it, which is you give a person some kind of ambiguous picture and with people on it. And you say, I want you to make up a story. You give them 10 or 15 of these things, and from those, you then go back and you code them for the number of times there's achievement imagery, the number of times there's power imagery, the number of times that there's intimacy imagery. And you assess their motives in that way so that they don't have to have any kind of conscious awareness of what's going on. You're coding essentially what's going on unconsciously. The interesting thing about it is that people have noticed for years is that people's self-reports of their motives do not correlate in the slightest with these fantasy picture reports of their motivation. The other interesting thing about it is that self-report motivations do predict some kinds of behaviors. For example, if you say to someone, now we're going to be in a situation where I want you to do really well, and then you test their behavior, you will find that how much they self-report achievement is important to them will in fact predict to some degree their behavior and how well they do. On the other hand, the other kind of the fantasy productions where you measure their motives indirectly will in fact predict people's motivations over the long haul in things like if a person is high on need for power as assessed from these picture stories, you will find that they will be over time a much better manager than someone who's low on need for power from those imagery stories. Yet at the same time, their self-reported need for power has no relationship whatsoever with their managerial success. So essentially, here are these two different kinds of motives, which they call implicit motives and self-attributed motives. The other interesting thing about these kind of motives is that actually they seem to have different developmental antecedents. That is, that need for power, for example, is strongly predicted. Need for power measured at age 41 or age 40. Or age 30, well, maybe 30, measured sometime in early to mid adulthood, is highly correlated with the severity of toilet training at age 2. That how you were toilet trained will predict the kind of how severely you were toilet trained will predict how much need for power that you have 30 years later. But that kind of toilet training will not at all predict your self-attributed need for power. Now, where this gets particularly interesting is when you see that their argument is that we have this whole motive system that's developed largely emotionally. Through lots of kind of non-verbal experiences, many of them early in life, that goes on underneath all of our other conscious motivational processes. And then what happens when you get into a conscious situation is you start using those conscious ones. Like let's give the example of your typical good 1990s liberal couple, where both are committed to the idea that men and women should share equally in the tasks of the household. Now, probably some of you are starting to smile because commitment means two different things. good liberal males will be committed to this in a very kind of conscious cognitive way, which is this is indeed what they believe in. And when you say to them, you know, you're not doing your share of the chores, they'll say, oh, you're absolutely right, I've got to pick this up. Or they might, on the other hand, say, of course I am. And they list off the 10 things they did last week when you did 45. But that's the example when they're consciously it's called to mind. But if you look at their routine operating procedures, you will often find something very different, which is that they were often not going to be participating very much in the household chores, because in a gut level way, that is not in fact what they want to do. That's not in fact what they feel, because when they were children, before times changed, there was much more sexual division of labor in families. And so their identifications with what does it mean to be a male, for example, are based much more on what did it mean to be a male in 1950, or what did it mean to be a male in 1920, than on what does it mean to be a male now. And so you can see this gross discrepancy between their conscious ideology and what they actually do over time, that you can get them to do what they really consciously believe in only if you call their attention to it, or if they get themselves to think about it routinely consciously. Okay, so those are some demonstrations of unconscious processes that come out of a laboratory. I now want to turn to another one of Freud's models, and that is his drive or instinct or energy model. This is his model of motivation, of what is it that we actually want in our deepest, most unconscious way. He basically believed that we have to have some kind of psychic energy that activates us, some kind of energy that makes us move, like any other system needs energy to be activated. The theory that he came up with eventually throughout his lifetime was that we have two basic motives, and those are sex and aggression. Now, I should say something before getting into this theory about what my own biases are. I am a psychoanalytically oriented psychologist. My practice is certainly more psychoanalytically oriented than any other type of orientation. At the same time, I am a research psychologist. I do teach at a university, and I am a fairly active member of a group called the Society for Exploration of Psychotherapy Integrations, which is oriented towards pulling what's best from the different approaches so that we can maximize our effectiveness as psychotherapists. I'm also someone who's fairly deeply committed to integrating across perspectives theoretically. And in fact, I'm much less enamored of people who try to sort of pick and choose a little bit of this approach and a little bit of that approach, kind of like a Chinese menu, than clinical work when it's based on some integrated theoretical notion of how these things all fit together. And part of my interest in integration actually came from working with introductory psychology students for years who would say, you know, we just got through all this stuff on unconscious processes. It makes all this sense. But then we just got through all this stuff on Skinner and conditioning, and that makes a lot of sense. And those don't fit together. How does it work? And that has been what much of my career thus far has been devoted to. So I'm telling you my biases so you know where I stand on this. My own bias is that Freud was probably not right that these are the two basic motivations in humans. My guess is that we have many basic motivations, and that many current contemporary psychoanalytically oriented psychologists, theorists, practitioners would instead, rather than talking about drives as he did, which he talked about these animal drives for sex and aggression, would talk about wishes, and would say that the basic thing that motivates us are wishes. And that some of those wishes are based in biology. We have wishes for sex. We have all kinds of aggressive wishes. We have different wishes for satisfying our hunger and thirst, etc. But that we have all kinds of other wishes that are mediated by our learning experience as well. But now that aside, Freud's model was that essentially, he was saying we are essentially animals like every other animal, and that what we pursue is always derivative of those animal motives. And that is something that's critical about psychoanalytic thinkers. It is certainly something that I would agree with, that we cannot think of ourselves as just these cognitive beings who don't have motives just like other animals have. In fact, if you look at neurologically, if you look at the nervous system of a human and a sheep, the centers of the brain in the brainstem that control many aspects of our motivation, as well as many aspects of just body temperature regulation, food intake, etc., are almost identical to those of a sheep. Some people are probably more identical. In any case, what that suggests is that what's happened evolutionarily is that we have these same basic structures. What we've done is to build on top of it new ways of controlling those in terms of new emotion regulation centers and cognitive regulation centers, but those haven't eliminated all that old stuff. That stuff is still there. You see it in young children before we get socialized, and Freud's argument, and I think he's absolutely right, is that you see it show up in all kinds of ways in people's adult behavior, ways that we would never think to tag back to those old motives. And I think what's most important about his dual instinct theory of sex and aggression is what Freud did was to spend a lot of time talking about motives that nobody else wants to talk about. You can read much of you can read thousands of pages of competing personality theories and never know that people, for example, have genitals, or never know that people pursue sex, or never even know that people reproduce, or never know that people sometimes not only aggress against other people but get a kick out of it. You'd never know that somebody enjoys watching boxing. Those are all examples of things that you can say this is something that Freud really got at, that other theories have not really gotten into, which is the dark side of human nature, the sides of ourselves, and not necessarily dark. Obviously, the sex isn't always a dark side, but the sides of ourselves that culturally we define as inappropriate in some ways, or as things to be controlled. I think that one of the virtues of Freud's theory in this respect is that Freud's theory is a theory that is not comfortable to discuss with your mother. And given that most of us have mental contents, things that we think about, and ways that we act that we wouldn't want to discuss with our mothers, a theory that's too comfortable talking with your mother is probably a problematic theory. In any case, I'm going to stop there, and we'll pick up on Freud's drive and instinct model and his other models in the next lecture.